My name is Scott Ross, and I've been involved with the visual effects industry since the mid-1980s. Prior to that, I ran a video post-production company in San Francisco, and then I was recruited by Lucasfilm in the mid-1980s to come and run Industrial Light and Magic. And I ran Industrial Light and Magic until the early 90s, but I happened to be there at the right time, and that time was as digital technology sort of came of age. So I was head of the company in the transition from the analog photochemical process to the digital process. So it was very, very exciting times. It was like Paris in the 20th century in the 1920s. And as a result of that, wound up deciding that I didn't really want to work for anybody anymore. I wanted to be entrepreneurial at the age of 40. And so I decided to start a company, and I did, called Digital Domain. And I ran that company for about 13 years and sold it in 2006 to a fellow by the name of John Texter and Michael Bay and a couple of other folks. And since 2006, I took about a couple of years to just recover, having done what I did for all of those years. And now I sit on various boards. I'm in the process of starting a new company. It's not a visual effects company. And I travel around the world and I speak often as I can on behalf of the visual effects industry and visual effects artists to try to make it a better world for visual effects creators. I've spoken about what the old days were like, and a lot of the people that have been around, and even the people that hadn't been around during the old days, look back at the old days as the good old days. In fact, the old days were the bad old days, and now they're just the worst new days. So it never really started with anything good or golden. Yes, the work has gotten better. The technology is more exciting. Visual effects has become more of an integral part of filmmaking. It's really now part of production. And in a lot of ways, it's the star of the movie. It is the most important sort of marketing hook for a movie, particularly in an international box office arena, which is what the world has become. But back in the day, I'm going to say in 1988 or so, having transitioned from a video post house and a commercial production company, and I came to ILM, I recognized that there was no trade association. Back in the commercial industry, we had the Association of Independent Commercial Producers. And it was a trade association that spoke on behalf of commercial production companies around the United States at that time. So when I got to Lucasfilm, I realized that it was really important for us to be able to have a trade association because even though we made some money back then, I felt that the value that we brought to the films was not fairly compensated. And that we, because of the business model at the time, and still to this day, that we sort of shouldered the burden of financial responsibilities on the visual effects side. And since we weren't in control of the process, I didn't think we should shoulder the responsibility. So 20 some odd years ago, I decided that we needed to be able to have a trade association. And I made that effort. We called it a VEC, the Association of Visual Effects Creators, the French word for with. And it was conceived well, but not accepted well, because the competition amongst the various visual effects companies, the 5 of them at that time, was so heavy and so laden with paranoia that we couldn't even sit at the same table and look at one another. And that Boss Films looked at Apogee, and Apogee looked at PDI, and PDI looked at ILM, and we just could not move the ball forward. So I felt strongly that we needed some sort of business relationship and association that can act on behalf of our industry to help the business model, which was flawed. Now we fast forward till the early 1990s or the mid-1990s, and all of a sudden there's this organization called the Visual Effects Society. My hope was, as an original founding member of the Visual Effects Society, was that the VES would take up that banner and they would run with it, and they would recognize that it don't mean a thing if it don't got that swing. If there's no cash, if you can't take care of your employees, if you can't make any money and reinvest in capital equipment and technology, if you can't stay in business, I don't care whether you're shooting on green screen or orange screen. It makes no difference. But the visual effects industry was not willing to accept that. They were not willing to have conversations about business. They weren't willing to have anyone represent them and go to the studio on their behalf. And so very soon thereafter, I left the Visual Effects Society, and I wasn't a member until last year. So 20 years went by, and I felt that an honorary society is interesting, but you have to solve the root cause problem of the industry, and that root cause is the business model is wrong. I think the problem in our industry was that, first of all, the people that make the work, the artists and the software and the technical people and the creative people, don't look at it that it's a business. I just recently had a conversation, I guess it was a day or so ago, with a senior creative visual effects person at one of the major visual effects facilities in the world today. And I said, "How old are you?" And the guy said, "I'm 45. And I said, "You probably make a pretty good living." He said, "Yeah, I do." I said, "And then what happens when you're 55? And he said, "Well, what do you mean?" I said, "You have a pension?" "No." "Well, how much money are you making?" "Well, I'm doing pretty well." "Well, you're doing pretty well now, but what happens when the subsidies go away? Or what happens when the industry shifts? Or what happens when you turn 55 or 60 or 65? And he thought for a second and he said, "Listen, I'm only interested in the art." So as wonderful as that sounds, you're missing the boat. You can't just be interested in the art, because if you are, go cut off your ear, eat cadmium yellow paint, and live in the south of France, because that's what art is about if you're only in it for the art. But the truth of the matter is that the art that these men and women create incredible value, billions of dollars worth of revenue for movie studios, and they should wind up at least having a situation where they're taken care of in their older years, in their senior years. There is sort of a zeitgeist about the movie industry. And the zeitgeist, I think, comes from what the movie moguls were like and what the business was like in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and then onward. They set up a culture, and the culture was nobody's making any money. And that was a lie. People were making money, lots of money. But the whole Buckwaldian economics of how pictures showed revenue or how it showed profit was able to create a fable that nobody's making any money. It also comes from a sensibility of, you're ripping me off. You're ripping me off. I know you're ripping me off. So if the studios act in the way where they rip off people, because they do, the whole gross profit participation, net profit participation, all of that stuff comes out of a culture of being able to manipulate money, right? So if that's the way the studio acts, well, they expect you to act the same way because you're in the same business. The problem is that the visual effects industry doesn't act that way. We actually have our costs plus markup, and the markup covers me and the overhead and the lights and the electricity and the computers and the postage and the telephone. There's no hidden gargantuan amounts of money that's being shoveled off somewhere, which there is in the motion picture studio business. So the other problem is that the budgets of visual effects films have gotten gargantuan. So when you're looking at the largest number on a production budget, nowadays on a blockbuster tentpole movie, it's visual effects, 50, 60, 75, $80 million. So the studio says, well, these people are charging $80 million, they must be making a fortune. But they're not. So it sets up this unholy relationship. The other problem with the movie studio is and they're learning now, because there are people like John Kilkenny and Todd Israelite that had come from places like Digital Domain and Industrial Light and Magic that now work for the studios. But the people that really make the decisions in the studios, they don't have a clue as to how visual effects are made. They just want it for less. So you give them a price, it's $100, I want it for $50. Well, $100 is the best I could do. Okay, great. Can you do it for $50? So it's not even about understanding the process and what it costs. I just want it for less because you're ripping me off. Now that simplifies things, but at the essence, that's what it's about. Has been my experience. I think that there are people that care. I just don't think they're willing to do anything about it. And I think some were, obviously, which is how the lawsuits came about. But I think at the core of it is there are 6 clients, and those 6 clients control the business. Don't piss them off, right? So it changes when you have a consumer base and you have 100 million people that are buying your product, and so you have to work with those 100 million people or market to those 100 million people, and if you wind up pissing off a certain portion of it, it's a bad thing, but you still have 95 million people that you're marketing to. In the visual effects industry, there are 6, and they talk, and they have a trade association. The sale to Disney by George didn't surprise me in the least. In some ways, I saw it coming, right? George got tired of it, in my opinion. You know, I don't personally know George. I only met him a couple of times, even though I used to run his company. I think he just got tired of it. You know, he comes back and he makes a movie and a bunch of fanboys make fun of him, and he never seemed that he could get on the good foot again. You know, even though he was making billions of dollars, he was not being accepted by his fan group. You know, they'd make fun of him on Jar Jar Binks. Red Tails comes out, it's a flop. You know, so I think George just got tired and said, I don't want to do this anymore. And he'd actually been saying it for a while. And the fact that it was sold to Disney was the right partner. Disney definitely was the right partner. And the fact that Kathy was involved, and how it was set up that Kathy was involved, I think brought George comfort. George always felt strongly that Kathy was a wunderkind, not longer a kind anymore, but that she was genius and brilliant, and he felt very comfortable with Kathy Kennedy. And so I think he felt, $4.2 billion, pretty soon it adds up to real money, as Everett Dirksen used to say. And 2, he was giving his legacy to a person he trusted more than anyone else from a creative point of view, and to a company that he had close ties with for many, many, many years with, you know, what was happening at Disneyland and conversations that he had had with the Walt Disney Company over the years. Even though none of his films were distributed by them, he had a very close relationship with the Walt Disney Company. So that was not surprising at all. ImageWorks wasn't surprising at all either because, you know, ImageWorks for many, many years was stumbling. They do great work. We've seen major changes in the executive suite. And I think the folks that run ImageWorks are bright, and they're looking for ways to compete. And the only way that they could really compete is to get out of Culver City and go to where the tax situation is much more attractive. And the subsidies in Vancouver make it a lot more attractive, and everyone else was moving there. And so it became the place to be, not only because the only way you were going to get work was to be in Vancouver, but also it would be very difficult to run an large independent visual effects studio in Los Angeles if you're sort of the only game in town, because where are you going to expand and contract with your workforce? So right now, the majority of the workforce is in Vancouver and in London, but mostly in Vancouver. So if you're running a visual effects facility, you sort of have to be in Vancouver. It's a sad state that you have to be, but you have to be. Personally, I don't think it's good for the industry, good for visual effects facilities, or good for visual effects artists. The benefit inures to the studio, the motion picture studio, not the visual effects company. Yeah, that was rough, you know. Did I want to sell the company? No. At the time, I didn't want to sell the company, but I was chairman and CEO of a company that had investors, and all of my investors wanted to sell the company at the time. And so my responsibility, my fiduciary responsibility, was to my investors. And so, yes, we were looking to sell the company. Did I have any idea that John Textor was going to become the John Textor that he became, and what happened with the company? No idea whatsoever, and was shocked and dismayed and hurt by it. On the other hand, even if I knew it back in 2006, I controlled, 13% of the company, and if the other investors wanted the company to be sold, there was nothing I could do about it, so it was sold.